Hello everyone, it's Linda Hayes coming to you for another week of CMIS2240. So this week we're on week 4, which is chapter 7, and we didn't have a class on Monday because of the holiday. And sorry about missing Wednesday. I had missed the fact that it was a holiday and that we were supposed to have class Wednesday, so I thought I'd do a recording so you could have the regular information that I'd already recorded or had already set up all the slides for. And if you do have other questions that we don't cover through this recording, make sure you just send me an email on that. So a couple of general reminders. First of all, ensure you use the client's chart of accounts first before deciding to create a new account. And you can see them always at the beginning of each chapter. And again, I just wanted to highlight the warnings that are in the text margin. Make sure you read these as you go through. I will highlight some as we do in the class each time, but I won't be going through every single one. So make sure you always watch the margin as you're doing your work. So this chapter is actually about planning a new business in Sage. So the steps that you're going to do are a bit different than the chapters so far, because here we're basically starting from scratch in taking a company and doing the complete setup. So you can see here that we create company files, we create and understand linked accounts, we set up all the accounts in the general ledger, payables and receivables. So this is where you're setting up charts of accounts plus the vendors and customers, and entering historical information for the customers and the suppliers, or vendors, suppliers, vendors being the same thing, and correcting historical transactions. Plus we'll set up credit cards and sales taxes and tax codes, so GST obviously commonly in Alberta, and with no actual sales tax, but a lot of companies buy things or work in different provinces, so the textbook does talk about sales taxes. And it also is talking about leaving history in an unbalanced state, and then finishing all the history after we do all of our entries, and entering post-data transactions is also covered in this chapter. So the first thing to note is that on the text page 202 all the way up to 206 has the company setup information, and that's what you're going to be using throughout the chapter. So you might want to make tabs on the different pages for the different information, so that you can go back and forth between the textbook where it's telling you to do it and whatever it is you're trying to set up, whether it's the supplier list, the customer list, those kind of things. And then it does have a list also of reports to be printed after completing the chapter. So you can see them checked off on the screenshot here. So this is on page 208 of the textbook. And basically what these allow you to do is check to your solutions to make sure things are correct. So again, if you're looking at your trial balance, all your amounts in the trial balance should match. If you look at journal entries, sometimes they will be in different order depending how you posted them and if you do corrections. So don't worry about that. But at the end of the day, if your balance sheet, income statement, and trial balance all match, you know that you've got your entries correct. So now I want to talk about linked accounts. It's covered on the text page 227. And basically, a linked account is something that Sage needs in order to be able to post transactions. So for example, if you're doing a receivable transaction for a customer, you want to create the invoice. When you go in to create the invoice for the customer, it asks you for which revenue account you want to credit for a receivable. And that's all you're going to enter. So let's say you enter an account number 4200 for sales revenue. Then it would have a tax code potentially if you're collecting tax on it, and then there would be the total. And when you post that, it automatically does the debit to accounts receivable. So that debit to accounts receivable has to be set up in Sage so that Sage knows where to post that debit to for all receivable transactions. It will go to that accounts receivable GL. Same thing on the payable side. When you set up a payables invoice to a supplier, it is going to automatically credit accounts payable. So initially, when you set up Sage, you have to say which GL account is your accounts payable where you want things to go. And there are other expense accounts you set up for linked accounts too, and you'll be doing this throughout the chapter to set up this new company that you're using for Chapter 7. Now, there's a couple of warnings that we wanted to talk about here. So the first one from the textbook I wanted to point out is talking about the fact that you have to define essential linked accounts before you can finish history for a company and before you can enter sales and purchase transactions. So this is where in the textbook, again, you have to really do everything in order. If you try to skip ahead, do something, you might not be able to do it if you didn't do some of the other steps first. And then another warning is that you can't remove any account in Sage if it's a linked account. So the process to do that involves first turning off linking, then deleting the account balance, saving the changes, and then you can remove the account. So you can't remove anything though if it has a balance or any journal entries have been posted to it. So if you do make a mistake in an account setup and it is a linked account, that's a process that you have to follow. So the second part of the chapter actually has a whole bunch of transactions that you want to record, and that's under the heading of source documents. So these start in the textbook on page 253 after the company setup. And what I would say to do in the chapter 7 is to, in the first week, get all the setup complete. And then that way, next week, you can work on the source documents. And if you start on them this week, make sure you watch the warnings. So I put a couple warnings in for some of the source documents, and these ones are on page 253 and 258. So the first one is that you have to enter outstanding invoices as historical invoices and the payments as current payments, or you'll be unable to finish history. And basically what this is that a company that has already existed, where it's not brand new starting up, when you first start creating the company in Sage, there's going to be some old amounts that are either owing to suppliers or receivable from customers, and those are what we're talking about entering here. So the other warning that I wanted to talk about is that you have a screen with the opening balance field, and that's added when you create a new account because the history is not finished. So in this case, you would leave that blank on page 258. So that's only if you're going ahead for the source documents this week. Other than that, if you could just get to the page 252 where the setup is done, that would be a really good start. And then next week, you would only be doing the source documents. So now I want to do the demo that we usually do in class. So the first thing I want to talk about is linked accounts. So when you're doing linked account setup, you do it in each module you're using. So for example, if we're looking at payables, like we are here, you go into payables and then you simply click on the linked accounts under the payable menu. So if we go setup and we go into settings, we can go into payables, and then you'll see in settings here, for payables, which is this menu here, you can see payables, you can see linked accounts. So if I click there, there's the drop down for invoices and payments and for goods received. So invoices and payments, you can see in the sample company here for accounts payable, it's this account here, 21,000. Freight expenses set up there, early payment purchase discounts, which is purchase discount, and then purchase prepayment. So all these GLs had to be set up, and you can click whatever account you want that's relevant to the specific company you're doing. And then also they have select bank accounts for different currencies. So this particular company has both a Canadian account and a US account, but every company is different. So that is the screen that you get into for the payables module. So again, you go into setup settings and go into linked accounts for payables. You could do the same thing for receivables. Here's the receivable drop down. You can go into linked accounts, and underneath there, you can click invoices and payments and see what they've set up. And if you don't set up an account that needs to be, it will give you a warning when you're trying to do transactions. So you can see in this sample company, they don't have anything for online payments because they don't have any in this particular example. But for everything else, they have set up default revenues, accounts receivable, etc. So hopefully that explains how linked accounts work. So next, I want to talk about creating a chart of accounts. And when you're opening a new company in Sage, you have to create all the general ledger accounts. And this is starting on the textbook on page 218, where you're creating all the new accounts. And there are some things that it's telling you to do initially in terms of how you set it up. So at the bottom of page 218, it says to click the check the validity of accounts tool for description of errors in account type, and then make the corrections required. And when I've taught this class many times in the past, students had huge issues with the setup of the chart of accounts. So I want to show for the sample company some errors you can have and explain the account types and how important it is. So the chart of accounts is already created here for this sample company in Sage, and you can see that there's types of accounts highlighted. So you can see here there's a current asset that's at H, which is a heading. Then we have a bunch of cash accounts here that have a total cash, which is account 10750, which is an S, where these are an A. So if we double click on one of these bank accounts, you can see in the general ledger, the A is highlighted here for a subgroup account. And because we want a total cash amount here, which is a subtotal, that means we need to have all A's followed by an S for the total. So basically, the heading for current assets is everything under current assets, which has a total at the end. 14,000 is the account. So you can see the heading is bolded here. The total is here as well. So you can see group heading in this general ledger screen. There's the group heading, which in this example is current assets. The group total in this example is total current assets. So every time you have a heading, you have to have a total. Okay, so an H and a T have to follow along with each other. You can't have a heading of a category without totaling it at the end. So even though there's a number associated with this, it's not an account you can post to in the chart of accounts. It's simply a total. Then we can see there's two different types of accounts that we have. We have the subgroup account and we have the group account. So the subgroup account is labeled with an A. The group account is labeled with a G. So you can see for cash, all of these accounts are A's because we have a subtotal for total cash. If we scroll down to investments, however, this particular company only has one investment, so it's an account G because they don't have many that need to be subtotaled. So if you were to look at the trial balance, you would see that there's no subtotal. It's just one balance for all the investments. Now, a different company where they might have stocks and bonds and GICs, they could have a whole bunch of A types for all of those, and then an S for a subtotal of total investments. But if you only have one account, it's simply a G, and then there's no subtotals with it. So you can see for AR, 1,200 up to total receivables, there's a whole bunch of A accounts here. So that's the A for the main accounts receivable, which they have Canadian and in US in this case. But then they have their allowance for doubtful accounts, holdback, and payroll. And all of those A's subtotal to the grand total of total receivables. And then there's a few accounts here under current assets where there aren't any subtotals needed, so they just put them as type Gs. So that is one of the things you have to double check as you're entering a brand new account. If I want to enter an account, I can go File. I'm just going to try to open a new account to show you what that looks like. So I'm going to go File, and I'm going to go Create to create a new account. And let's say I wanted to set up a new account under Accounts Receivable. So I want it to be Other Receivables because this company doesn't have Other Receivables. So let's just pretend we have an account we want called Other AR. And I'm going to set up the number to be something compared to accounts receivable here, right? So accounts receivables, 12,000 in this case. AR is 120.50, and then holdbacks is 120.100. So let's say I just call this for, it doesn't really matter for argument's sake, but let's say I'm going to do 120.060, okay? And other AR. Whoops, other 60 is what I said. And I want it to be other AR. And if I just create this, and it's called a group account, you're going to see what happens. This cannot be a group account because the numbering is within the AR numbering system. It wants to add it into the subtotal for total receivables, which is what I want it to do. But let's just make the mistake on purpose. I know I do need to change this to be a subgroup account, but let's say I forget to do that and I leave it at the default, which is what students often do. So I'm just going to say save and close. I'm going to get an error that pops up, and you can see it right here. It says your accounts are not in logical order. The reason is there's a missing subgroup total before account 1060 other AR. Because if you have a balance with a whole bunch of A's, you need to always have a subtotal before you have another G account. So it says until this issue is resolved, you cannot open some of your reports. So this is an easy fix to correct, but I wanted to show you guys how to do that. So I'm going to click OK here. And I'm going to go into the account I just created, the other AR. I could just double click it. And it comes up here. And I can go, okay, I see I have a G in the middle of a bunch of A's that I want to subtotal to total receivables. So all I do is click on it and go, okay, I want this to be a subgroup account. And I'm going to save that. And now I don't have an error. And let's say you've not really got an error, but you want to check that everything's correct. as you've set up accounts. And I would do this periodically as you set up a whole bunch of accounts. So say you set up all the cash accounts for this particular company, you could then click this little check mark, which I'm hovering over, that says check the validity of accounts. And if I check this button, I get a message that pops up saying the accounts are in logical order. Okay, so then I can just say, okay, I know everything is correct. If I didn't do that, like say I did a mistake, like I showed before, if I went and created something as a group account when it should have been a subgroup account. So for example, let's go back to my account that I set up, other AR. And let's say I do that mistake again and go save and close. And the error does pop up, but let's say I just ignore it and I have it in there. I mean, whatever, this is what the report looks like right now in my chart of accounts. If I check the validity here, it's going to give me that error pop up again. So if you accidentally unclick it, you can just go in here and check it. So in this case, this other AR, I don't want this account to be there. And because it's not a linked account for anything, I can delete it. So I wanted to demo that for you as well. So I just highlight the particular account I want to delete, and I can go into File, and File, and I can click Remove. So this file menu is helpful when you're inside the chart of accounts. There's Open a new account, Create a new account, and Remove an account. So I'm going to remove that account that I just set up. And it says, are you sure you want to remove the account? And I just say yes, and then that account is now gone. So just be very careful when you're creating all of your accounts to make sure you pay attention. Is it a subgroup account, which it'll show as a type A, which has a subtotal, or is it a G account where there is no subtotal required? And then the other thing I mentioned, make sure you have an H and a T. A heading has to also have a total for it. So we have the heading current assets, and then we have total current assets. If we scroll down, we can see inventory is the same. We have a heading for inventory assets and then a total inventory assets. But there was no subtotal, so all of those particular ones are G type. So hopefully this helps with the chart of accounts setup that you do. So for next week, you would just be continuing with Chapter 7. And when we have our class on Monday, we will just cover questions that people have, because I don't really have anything else about Chapter 7 to cover. So on Monday, when we come into Zoom, if you have any questions, make sure you have those ready to ask in the class on Monday. And good luck, everyone, with Chapter 7.